Joining us from Australia is Antony Loewenstein, an independent journalist, author of the Palestine Laboratory and also My Israel Question. Thank you so much for joining us, Antony. You seem to have dedicated a lot of your professional life as a journalist towards studying the Middle East and Israel in particular. You also lived for a number of years in occupied East Jerusalem. Did you foresee this coming? I mean, has the Israeli government been looking for an excuse like October the 7th for a long time?
Yes, is the short answer. Look, at the end of my book, The Palestine Laboratory, which came out just before October 7, I talked about, or I feared, a cataclysmic event, a war, an attack. I'm not for a second suggesting I predicted exactly what October 7 would be, of course. But I did fear that that would give the Israeli government, the Netanyahu government, and Israeli society, importantly, the so-called justification to do what they're doing in Gaza and beyond. Now, did I expect there to be this genocidal war, this extent of the torture and the violence? I don't even know if I expected it to be this extreme and lasting for so long. You know, we often hear about this idea that, and I heard you say this before, that Israel is increasingly isolated internationally. There's some truth to that, but there's also completely untruth to that. And what I mean by that is that, yes, there's growing public protest. There's a growing countries, particularly Spain and others, that are cutting military ties, cutting military contracts, and that's important. But the countries that really matter, the US, much of Europe, and frankly, much of the Arab Muslim world, have not cut ties with Israel. In fact, the opposite. They've maintained ties, in some cases even deepened them, despite their public calls of outrage. So, look, October 7 was an undeniably horrific event, and I remember as soon as it happened on the actual day, on that day 2 years ago, I realized straight away that Israel's response was going to be a catastrophe for everybody, particularly the Palestinians. And sadly, like many of us, I've been proven correct.
Do you think that there's a concerted political coming together of that evangelical Christian right-wing element that Trump likes to appeal to in the United States? And you think of his ambassador to Israel, Mick Huckabee, who's an extreme evangelist and expansionist and wants Israel to occupy the whole of the West Bank, it seems. That element of the right wing, and let's bear in mind, Antony, many people say that they are white supremacists, those in America. But is there an alliance between them and the Zionist element of the far right in the Israeli government?
Well, very prominent alliance. And it's worth saying that it's partly because growing numbers of so-called liberal Jews in the West increasingly don't like Israel. There was a Washington Post poll that came out just last week, which found that a sizable proportion of Jews think that Israel is committing war crimes. About 40% thought Israel was committing genocide. Now, they still felt a majority of some connection to Israel as a Jewish state, and there was deep animosity towards the Netanyahu government. So to replace, so to speak, those liberal Jews who increasingly are so disillusioned, Israel for sure is embracing evangelical Christians. A lot of the money that Israel's now spending on propaganda is going to those communities to get Christian influencers, Catholic influencers to go to Israel, to go to Gaza and spread lies. And one of the most disturbing elements of these alliances is not just the evangelicals, but Israel openly and proudly backing the global far right. One quick example. In the last few days, the Israeli government has invited next week Tommy Robinson, a far right extremist from the UK, to visit Israel on a solidarity mission, including potentially to go to Gaza. Now, many Jewish groups, sane people, are saying this is absurd, this is crazy. How can you want to partner with someone and his followers who are so vehemently anti-Islam, anti-immigration, an extremist, essentially? And the argument is really clear. The Israeli government has doubled and tripled down, saying we see someone like him as our future. An alliance between Israel and the global far right makes sense if you understand where Israel is heading. A deeply authoritarian state, potentially Jewish theocratic, but as bad as that, the idea that the anti-Islam, anti-immigration rhetoric, which is growing in popularity in the West, is exactly what Israel represents, an ethno-nationalist state. So when you have someone like a Tommy Robinson or people like him, they admire Israel for that because they want to create a Christian ethno-nationalist state, in his case in the UK. That sort of alliance should deeply, deeply disturb us. And yet I don't hear enough Jewish groups, some yes, but not nearly enough Jewish groups condemning that. And they need to do it in the strongest possible terms.
Therefore, if any possible peace plan doesn't address the future of a Palestinian state, what is the purpose of it? Will it provide a longer-term security for Israel? Is Hamas not just the latest iteration of an armed struggle against occupation? And if there's no future hope of a Palestinian state, there will just be another group, presumably, that comes up.
Which is what I would argue what Israel would ideally want. And it's why, for years, frankly, Israel backed and funded Hamas. People seem to forget this pretty important detail. Netanyahu, for years before October 7, was facilitating cash to go into Gaza to Hamas. Now, you're right, if Hamas disappears tomorrow, which they won't, but if they do, there'll be a replacement. And Trump's so-called 20-point plan really sets up the possibility of a long-term different form of occupation, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. And when you have the growing Gazification of the West Bank, growing ethnic cleansing, removal of villages, Bedouins and Palestinians and many others, you have a model that has not really been addressed by Trump. In fact, the plan that Trump presented last week doesn't really seriously address that. Maybe he says he's against annexation officially, but there's annexation happening. It's been happening for years unofficially, and the Israeli government knows it. And it's worth just saying one thing on this point. Benny Gantz, a so-called Israeli opposition leader, wrote a piece in the New York Times a few weeks ago, which really revealed the reality and the delusion, in fact, that exists within the international community. That the problem here is Netanyahu. He basically says, no Israeli Jews support a two-state solution. None of us support a Palestinian state. We basically support the Netanyahu agenda, but we hate him. That's the summary of the piece. So if and when there's an Israeli election and when Netanyahu may well fall as prime minister and is replaced by a Naftali Bennett or somebody else, the agenda is clear. So Israel's trajectory is, to me, an incredibly dark one of long-term occupation because there's no prices that are being paid by Israelis. There's no economic pain at all at the moment. Now, yes, the economy is turning a little bit. And yes, as I said, at least $1 billion of arms deals have been severed in the last month, something I welcome. And more countries need to do that for Israel to face real economic pain. But until that happens, Israel feels, whether it's Netanyahu or someone else, profound impunity still to this day, an arrogance, a hubris. And that won't change until the economic situation evolves.
Antony Loewenstein, thank you so much.